Morning, everybody. Morning. A couple of brief housekeeping things I've been asked to say. First of all, please silence your phones. Secondly, the session is going to last 50 minutes, and we will have 10 minutes for a Q&A as well at the end. And Charles and I will also be available for a private conversation with anybody here afterwards in room 109, should you care to be there. Great. Well, welcome to our panel. My name is Jonathan Burnham. I'm a publisher. I'm the publisher of HarperCollins. And I'm very proud to be talking to Charles Blow, whose work I admire enormously. Charles is a highly acclaimed, award-winning journalist who has been a columnist for the New York Times since, I think, 2008, thereabouts, and is a commentator on television frequently and writes about many political issues, but also several issues that come very close to the subject of this book. And we're here today to discuss his memoir, Fire Shut Up in My Bones, which was published 2 years ago in hardcover to, I'd say, really rapturous reviews. It is an extraordinary book, very powerful, very moving, beautifully written, and what's most remarkable about it, I think, is it has a sort of serene surface of great calm and insight that contains extraordinary, powerful emotions: anger, fear, rage, disappointment. All these things are held within this very strong, very gentle prose. And in a way that reflects the title itself, I feel, this idea of things tightly contained. But it's an extraordinary read. I don't know how many people here have actually read the book, so we will talk as if you haven't read the book and try not to give too much away, although it's going to be difficult. But briefly, let's just talk about what the book is and how it tells its story. For me, my experience of reading it, it was like a sort of split screen. It was two things at the same time. On one level, it was a lyrical coming-of-age memoir set in Louisiana, North Louisiana, in a very small rural community, with passages of beauty and memory, evocation of food, happy memories, people, an extended family, friends. And then at another level, which happens at the same time, the book is in a way a kind of psychological thriller. Something very dark and traumatic happens early on to Charles, which is a thread that weaves its way through the story. So it has this sort of double perspective that makes the read incredibly powerful, almost unbearably tense, particularly since the book begins with a scene where the 20-year-old Charles is setting off in a car with a gun intent on killing somebody. And the action proceeds from there. But the book rewinds, and we begin with you. You're born in 1970. Do you want to talk a little bit about the world you grew up in, the place you grew up in, what it was like?
Well, I call it, well, thanks for having me, by the way, and thanks for coming. It's a big crowd. Small town, I call it small place right in the middle of nowhere. And the town is called Gibbsland because it was quite literally Gibbs land. It was an old plantation by a man named Gibbs, the entire town. And it was a segregated town. All blacks lived on the west side of town. We lived on the last street on the west side. So I always say we lived on the blackest street in town. And that kind of layer of segregation kind of hovered over everything, but in a way that is very different from what I register with most people that I interact with in the world, because it was a self-contained world. So I never saw white people. All the smartest people in every room I ever entered were black. So I just assumed that the smartest people in any room would be black. So you kind of emerge from this world with that kind of confidence that you can do anything, because that has always been the template for what you have always seen. And it is kind of a historical, educational center. It was the high school that I went to was founded as a college to educate the sons and daughters of freed slaves. And the high school still sits in the same spot. And so you have a century of erudite pictures of black educators and professors on the walls of this high school. And that changes your entire perspective about what your place is in the world. And so it was both, in a way, uplifting, but also oppressive, because it is incredibly poor. But they have this jewel that they've had forever. And it's completely awash in violence because there is no real governmental architecture. So people, if something goes wrong, you fix it. And you let the law deal with the aftermath of that. And people fix it themselves, often with gun barrels. And that was kind of my upbringing.
Talk a bit about the poverty, because some of the descriptions which you lay on with a gentle hand are very powerful. There's one story about a cattle truck having an accident, where the whole community gathers together and moves towards it. Do you want to talk about that?
So we were about a mile south of Interstate 20. So the interstate system comes through and runs these parallel tracks all across America, whereas highways used to take people through cities. The interstates basically starved some cities and helped to build others. Ours was a city that it starved because the interstate took all the traffic away from our city. So it's about a mile north. And I don't know if you remember, 30, 40 years ago, cars were not as safe. There were car accidents all the time. Trucks used to flip over all the time. And so when a cargo truck of any sort would have an accident near our exit, it would light up. The phones would light up, and everybody in town, the onion truck just turned over, and everybody would go up and pick up the onions, right? And one day it was a cattle truck, bingo. And so it was like cattle truck. And so it was just like a sleepy night, as it often was, and we go up to where the cattle truck has overturned. And they're scarring on the asphalt, and they pull it away, and we have rifles. Because my mother was kind of the survivor of survivors. On the one hand, she refused to ever take charity of any sort, and she thought of any sort of government welfare as charity. So no matter how poor we were never going to take anything from anybody. But we didn't have anything. And so we farmed, we grew our own vegetables. When everybody else was riding by on their bicycles, we were out picking tomatoes. She was like, you're gonna eat better than everybody in this neighborhood. And when that cattle truck overturned, we ran up there with rifles, and she said, there's no way that we're gonna let these injured cows limp into these woods and be picked to death by vultures. We're gonna eat this winter. And we shot cows, injured cows that they had left to die. And she called the guy, one of the major industries in the area was kind of cutting wood and taking it to the local plant. So everybody had what we call a pulpwood truck. So they had these giant cranes that they would lift the logs with. She called the guy she knew that had one of those. And that was what lifted those cows and put them into trunks of cars. We drove through the middle of nowhere to an uncle who lived maybe 20 miles away. And he really lived in the middle of nowhere, so nobody would see them slaughter cows in the middle of the night. They stayed up all night slaughtering cattle, and we ate steaks all winter. So, it was that kind of, that was in her mind, like she would never steal, but she was like, they're literally gonna lip in those to the woods and die. That's dumb.
So your mother is one of the heroes of this book in a way. She's powerful and strong. She's always there. She's self-educating through the book. Your father, on the other hand, is kind of a mostly absent figure. Do you want to talk about that, your relationship with him a little bit?
So I have no pictures of my father as a young man, although everyone tells me he was incredibly handsome and dashing, and he was a member of a band. And my mom has been to a nightclub, she says, once in her life. She drank alcohol, it tastes horrible, she threw up, she never went back ever again. My mother didn't drink, she didn't smoke, she didn't go to parties, she didn't do anything. So I could never understand how these two people had ever married each other. You know, he drank everything that didn't drink him, and she drank nothing. And but I kept asking, she says, well, they told us we should get married. I was like, relatives? I was like, yeah, people said we should get married. And they went and, some guy was, who turned out to have married a preacher without a church. He was working on a house one day, took a break, married them under a shade tree. That was the whole wedding. There was no one present. But he continued to be a carousing man, and he was very charming, and he was always in juke joints. That meant that he met juke joint women, and they liked him a lot. And it created incredible tension for them. But his father had never been around for him. His father, he comes from, his father and his father's family were actually a very well-to-do family. They are born, all the blows that we come through Alabama into Louisiana. So they're born in Southampton, Virginia. The same person who enslaved my ancestors, we assume, also enslaved Dred Scott, who all of us know, right? So he comes with 6 slaves out of Southampton. Dred Scott, my ancestors. My ancestors buy their own freedom in Alabama, and they are really kind of a well-to-do family there. And my great-grandfather, I'm giving the great-greats, right? Gets kind of run out of Alabama because for tampering with an election. They trusted him with the ballot box, and the Ku Klux Klan guy was going to win. He's like, no way, he stashed the ballots or something. I don't know how the story goes. And he had to leave. And so he comes to Louisiana, and he makes another kind of prominent living for himself. He is the blacksmith. He starts the first church in that region. He is famous for making these baskets out of white oak, which I have one of. The only last remaining one is in my bedroom. He is a very prominent person in the community. They're very fair-skinned, so I assume there's something happening with master blow and somebody, one of the slaves, because none of my father's father or none of his ancestors look anything like me. They all look like they're white. And so my father's father has a relationship with my grandmother that produces a child. My grandmother has had relationships with a lot of men, so she has a lot of kids by different men. But my mother describes her as the most beautiful dark-skinned woman she had ever seen in her life. And my grandfather thought the same of her. But the family did not register him, this incredibly fair-skinned man, having a child out of wedlock with this dark-skinned woman as a positive. And that meant that my father's father was relatively absent from his life. And so his concept, of what it means to be a family and what cohesion means in a family is disturbed by that, and so when he marries my mother, only in writing this book, I come to understand this is the first time he has had any stability in terms of family in his entire life. And the family that he creates with my mother is his only real anchor in the world. And he doesn't actually know, he doesn't have the emotional tools to know what it means to love a child or what it means to hurt a child. So he has never been abusive to me, never yelled at me in my entire life. But also I take that as kind of a negative, because if you cared, you would have said something eventually about something. But there's an incredible detachment with him. Only in the last 10 years have I seen him age. No, before that, there were no gray hairs, there were no wrinkles. He was still an incredibly handsome man. And that's because he never worried about anything, right? He never cared. So I struggle with that. Like, what do you make of a person who is that way?
And when he does try to reconcile with your mother a few times, it doesn't go too well. There's a scene I remember where she chases after him with a gun.
Yes. Here's the thing. Even when he would try to reconcile with my mother, he wouldn't refuse to shake loose the other women that he had always around him, right? And so the women, so there's that scene you're talking about. My mother has left him. We started over in my great-grandfather's house where my mother had grown up with her grandfather. And but because she's not the most social person, she's not going to go out and meet people. Of all the things he is safe. He is not a dangerous man. He is not an abusive man. He's emotionally manipulative, but he is not physically abusive to her. He wouldn't hurt her. He wouldn't hurt her children. And she knew that. And she knew him. There's something about the safety and intimacy of knowing. And so they sleep together one night, and she's up making breakfast, and cheerful mood, and the phone rings, and somebody hangs up, and the phone rings again and hangs up, and eventually a child is on the phone and says, "May I speak to my father?" And my mom thinks, how does anybody know he's here? And she gives him the phone, and then she picks up the other line. These lines were connected back then. She picks up the other line in the living room, and the kid says, my mom says, meet her at the juke joint. And my mother, you had the scraper out the ceiling. Like she goes, she's beside herself, and I think she's angry with herself that she knows the character of this man, and she has allowed herself to believe again, and she believes that that it is her fault that she has opened herself up to be hurt by him again, and that these women continuously come around the house, come to the house, call the house whenever he's there, and it violates her space. And so she rustles for the gun. He grabs his trousers, and I'm looking out the window, and I hear the gunshots, and he's jumping over the barbed wire fence, and I kind of laugh at that. I remember as a kid I was smiling, because he looked like he wasn't really running for his life. It looked funny to me as a little kid. I'm 5 years old, or 6 or something. And as I write in the book, I think he was running that way because he knew that she would not shoot him. And that the distance was too short. She could have, if she wanted to hit him, she could hit him. And the phrase I use is, the reason is that a heart still works even when it's broken. That she still loved him, but her heart was broken, and she wanted to scare him, and she wanted to demonstrate to herself, she wanted to have some power in this moment of incredible vulnerability, and that was what it was.
So you live in this community, a large extended family surrounding you, and yet you describe yourself from really quite an early age as lonely, feeling lonely in the world. And then at a certain point early on in the narrative, the sort of key event happens, the sort of break in the book, which is that your cousin Chester comes to stay. And Chester is how old when he's like a young teenager?
He's a teenager,
yeah.
So maybe 14, 15.
And you're like
7
or 8, 7. Chester is kind of a bad boy, and he kind of encourages you to do bad things, like steal from the local store and so on. But there's a feeling that you're flattered by the fact that he's decided to befriend you, and
yes.
he's chosen you as
yes.
his like person to be with.
Yes.
So your kind of loneliness is broken, and you feel closer to him, and you share a room at night, and he comes into bed with you, and he physically abuses you. And you describe that moment in extraordinary detail. You know exactly what's happening. You can't speak, you can't cry out, and you can't even tell him to stop. But eventually he pulls back, and he tries again, and he continues. And the next day, you realize that in a way you have to live with this secret. You can't tell anybody, you can't tell your mother. You fear the consequences of what would happen. And you talk about this act as, and you use this word a lot in the book, betrayal. Do you want to talk about what that word means? Because it becomes this key word, this idea of betrayal, that was what had happened in that moment.
Right, because I do believe that kind of any act of violence between people with whom you share some sort of intimate relationship, whether that is family or friendships or whatever, when that person, not a stranger, harms you, it is betrayal. It is betrayal of the love you shared, it is a betrayal of the relationship that you had. And it was really hard for me to process how to deal with that. And I look back on it now. I mean, so survivors of childhood sexual abuse and of any sort of kind of abuse, particularly sexual abuse, you always process it with the mind of the person at the date of the abuse, right? So even if you're 46 years old, you're processing it as if you're 7. You keep saying, as a 7-year-old, what could I have done? What should I have done? How could I have handled it differently? And it's hard to register with yourself that you were 7 years old. You don't have the tools. Whatever you did, there was no fault in it. And it wasn't until I remember seeing my youngest son, he was 7 years old, about that age, and he used to walk on his hands is like we walk on our feet. We loved this, entertain people with the idea he was strong enough to do this. And he's upside down in my favorite chair in the living room, and he's watching cartoons upside down with his legs over the back of the chair and his hands in the chair. He's looking like this. And I walk in and I thought, it's kind of funny. And I thought, my God, look how small he is. He's 7 years old. And it dawned on me how that little boy upside down in a chair would have no equipment, emotional equipment to deal with that, and that I had to stop processing that act as if the 40-year-old was inhabiting the 7-year-old's body. It's an act of learning to forgive yourself. But yes, it becomes a pivotal thing. And also, let me just say one other thing. This is kind of a digression, but this is something as a writer that I wrote this book for like 9 years, start to finish, but I wasn't writing all the time, obviously. Might have been a little bit too long, because at the end I started to play games. So the book is in a way a giant riddle and jigsaw puzzle, and nobody registers that but me, but I'm supremely delighted that it's a riddle and jigsaw puzzle. So there may be 100 biblical references hidden in the book. First of all, the title is from the Bible, but everything. And it was my first description of Chester where my editor registered something was going on. because one of the lines was full of deceit and all cunning. She was like, that's an odd phrase. That is the phrase that Paul uses when he first meets the sorcerer Bar Jesus. And he says, you look like the devil. To me, Chester was the devil, and that he was beguiling in a way that kind of cast a spell on me in that moment. Now, that is such a tiny thing, but there's like 100 of these throughout the book, where as a writer, I started to enjoy the idea that I would hide things, and that maybe someone would find them, and maybe no one would, but that I knew that they existed, and it was fun to do. So just so you know.
Yeah, but also it reflects in the book, one of the things that happens after this event with Chester is that your sexual identity in a way is kind of blown apart. You recognize that what's happened is an act between two men, and that may be wrong. And you go to the Bible and you read Leviticus, and you look at that text, and then you read the whole book of Leviticus and decide to live by those words, right? So this must have, you drank in that as kind of the only place you could go to for advice and help.
Right, I mean,
or whatever.
Well, I think I go to all the places available to me. So I go to the Bible, and when that doesn't work, I go to sports. When that doesn't work, I go to fraternity life. When that, I mean, like, I try everything available to a young man, because I am convinced that he has broken something in me and that I have to find a way to fix it. And it is not until the end where I kind of come to the realization that he did not break something, that how I am is how I was always meant to be, that he has just violated a trust. But in the course of believing that he had broken something, I try all the ways I believe that a kid could try to fix it without telling anybody.
And I think what happens then is that quest for trying to understand what I think actually becomes the theme of the book, which is, what does it mean to be a man? How do you define masculinity? Your father wasn't around very much. Your sexual identity was suddenly challenged in this extraordinary way. And then there's an interesting part of the book where you look around you in the community and you see other young guys, other boys, some of whom are clearly homosexual, outwardly, overtly, openly homosexual, and you describe that with a kind of fascination, that they have the courage to be effeminate, to be flamboyant in this world and not be embarrassed by it. And you write almost with admiration that they can define themselves in that way. And there's actually a very moving description of a guy called Lawrence who comes. Do you want to talk a little about what happens to him? Because in a way it's a very dark lesson.
So Lawrence is, I have two, so they would both be second cousins. And these were the only two men, adults, who I register in this tiny town as being gay, although no one ever saw them with another guy. But you knew that they weren't interested in girls. And they made sure that you knew that they weren't interested in girls. And they were so much alike. I mean, they both played the piano at their churches, and they both had the same hairstyle. I mean, it was crazy. But they weren't friends. They just were alike. But Lawrence was, fascinating to me because the only times I ever saw him, my brother was an apprentice at the upholstery shop down the street. So sometimes at night I'd just walk down. There's nothing to do in this tiny town. So I'd walk down to the upholstery shop because the upholstery shop was owned by an adult cousin who had gone away to the Vietnam War, come back with post-traumatic stress, everything. And he never wanted to go home. So he would be there until the middle of the night playing music, and there were dirty magazines, and it was just an illicit place that you could go. And Lawrence would stop by sometimes at the upholstery shop. And I had never seen someone so aggressively flirt. They were both cousins of God, but they weren't cousins of each other. And he would flirt, and the guy the cousin who was a Vietnam vet, I write in the book, he had seen real horror, so he had no intention of being mean to a person who posed him no harm. So he just laughed it all off. And I think that the laughter actually encouraged Lawrence and amplified the flirting. So I would just watch this, with all kinds of fascination. And looking back on it, it occurred to me that Lawrence was completely alone in this place. There was no community. There was no bar that you could escape to. There was no, no club. Lawrence was being Lawrence in the face of everyone who's told him that he should not be Lawrence, and he refused to apologize for it. And in retrospect, it is the bravest thing that I think anyone could do, to insist on you seeing me, even if I must be seen alone. But Lawrence comes to a tragic end. A couple of years, I don't know if it's before or after, Matthew Shepard, is small town, tied to a fence, killed. The whole world says this is outrageous. Lawrence is tied to a bed, stripped naked, killed. And no one says a word. And I could not get the juxtaposition out of my head. In the writing of this book, I even looked for an obit. I couldn't find an obit for Lawrence. And the way that the community behaved as if they were ashamed of him for the way that he had died, rather than being outraged that someone had killed him. In this community, someone who they assumed had been having sex with him privately, I found outrageous. Lawrence had played the piano at every funeral of every one of your relatives, and you refused to come to his. I still shake a little bit because I'm still outraged by it.
He's recorded here in your book, which is something. And you then look for male role models in the world. And you write that there were two men who inspired you as potential figures to emulate. One is Martin Luther King, which is not surprising. The second, slightly more surprising, is Prince Charles. Yeah. Was it the tweed jacket?
I don't know why this is surprising. Listen, I'm a teenager. Television, there's this rather common-looking girl, and the Prince guy is going to marry this Diana lady, and it's all over television, and I say, wait, there's a prince, and his name is Charles. I could be a prince. And I just start to watch every single thing that he does. The way he holds his hands, the way he comports himself in interviews, the way he laughs. He likes to do this thing. He likes to put his hand here. I didn't like that, so I didn't do that. But everything else I took, right? Do you clasp your hands behind your back when you're standing in front of someone or before? And every detail I took. I believe that to become someone, it all became theater to me. Life became theater. And that all I had to do to become someone was to behave like someone. I went to the local library. I checked out every book of etiquette in the entire library. It was like I was reading a book of secrets that you had tried to keep from me. And I remembered every fork, spoon. We didn't even have that many forks and spoons. It would take our entire set of silverware to create that many forks and spoons. What everyone did. What happened? What do you do if food falls on the floor? What means when you fold your napkin and put it on top of your coffee cup? Everything. Because I believed that I could assume the identity of a prince. And that's what I did. That's not funny, Darren.
I just want to bring one final topic up before we move on to questions, because it's so significant and it really forms it's the final section of the book, and this is truly addressing the question, the puzzle of masculinity, which is, and to me as a Brit, was completely incomprehensible. I could not understand anything that was happening in these pages. You go to Grambling, which is a very prestigious school, and you decide to pledge, correct me if I get the terminology wrong, the pledge of fraternity, which involves a very complicated series of rituals of hazing of such brutality that I couldn't believe it. I mean, terrifying, dark, horrible, involving gross acts, cruelty to animals, cruelty to each other, a kind of institutionalized, the kittens?
Oh yeah, but we weren't.
I know, you pulled back. But nevertheless, what struck me as strange was that you write about it almost as if it were bullying, as if this is some kind of bullying system, but yet it's voluntary. You're all in it. You all decide to do it. You agree to do it. It's mutual, it's consenting. And I couldn't understand what was going on.
Well, it is bullying. It is ritualized bullying. You decide that you're going to do this sort of bullying at this time during the semester of each year with this number of people, and you vote on it. But it is a form of kind of institutional, ritualized, very extreme, barbaric bullying, and that people submit to it. It doesn't make sense, but other than it preys on particularly young men's desire for some sort of rite of passage, like that proves physically that they have some, stamina and ability to survive something, and that they see that as a way of proof, of a way of kind of crossing some threshold, and that the system preys on that. That in fact, on the other side of it, that the problem with hazing is that it actually works, meaning victims of group trauma will bind themselves together. I don't care if you all went down in a plane crash and you survived, you will be forever bound to the other survivors of that crash. I don't care if you were all prisoners of war, if you were in the same camp, you will always be bound to the other prisoners of that war. Group trauma binds people together, but this is a manufactured trauma. So human beings manufacture this incredible barbarism, and that trauma binds the people who go through it together. So the binding works. And so I often tell people, because I often speak out in anti-hazing forums, that about how you create bonding through positive experiences rather than through group trauma. But the idea that these young people, particularly people from kind of broken environments, broken communities, broken homes, are desperate for human connection and bonding and would subject themselves to this, means that there is an incredible appetite for vulnerability, to be able to bind themselves spiritually to other human beings in a way that they find honorable. These are very human pursuits. And because as a culture we have kind of decimated certain environments and certain communities, those people are even more vulnerable to submitting themselves and their bodies.
And that was you. I mean,
Yes.
you were someone who was lonely,
Absolutely.
who was confused about his own masculinity and what that meant, and this was a way of joining a group of which you became the head. I mean, you became the president. And in a way triumphing, but at the same time, at the end of the book, you look back on this and say, no, this was a bad thing. This was the root of pain I took.
Right. While in flight from a monster, I became a monster.
Exactly.
Right, and that is the problem of it. That is the flaw. That's the lie of it. That you don't reduce yourself every time you are cruel to another human being. You can't tell yourself that lie, or you can only tell yourself that lie for so long before you awaken to the truth of it, which is that you are surrendering part of your humanity every time you engage.
We have less than 10 minutes left, so I'm going to open up the floor to questions. We have a microphone, so anybody who wants to ask a question.
Charles, what do you say to your children to keep them safe, to help them move through the world?
In what way? I mean, safe from...
I think talk about the talk. Some people give their sons the talk. Do you give your kids the talk, or do you say something else to them?
No, he's saying the talk. I don't know if anybody knows what we're talking about, the talk. So the talk is the talk that particularly, maybe other people do this too, but particularly black families talk to black children about how you encounter authority and survive those encounters without incident. Right? And this is very much a very real thing that happens. The problem is that I think that most people think that it is, a large oak table with candles and we sit down and there's hoods and we go, it's not that formal. It is constant. It is, you're watching the news and you say, oh, dang, that kid got shot. You see what happened? You're like, don't do this. Keep your hands in your pockets. Or if you're driving, put your hands on the steering wheel until they tell you to take your hands out. I mean, it's little things over the course of many years, and you're constantly using every example in a life to reinforce something you've already said, or to say something new and different about how you survive an encounter, whether or not that is, how you, and this is part of the violence that society forces black parents to do to their own children, which is to clip their wings. It is an incredible thing. When you find the words coming out of your mouth, which I have found the words coming out of my mouth, to say, if your friends run and you guys are hanging out in the park and your friends run because, cops are them or whatever, you can't. It's an incredible sentence that you have to say to a child, to tell them that they are not the same as their friends, that they do not have the same latitude to behave like them and survive in the world. And yet you balance that violence, that psychological violence that you're doing to them, that clipping of their wings, to the reduction of them as human beings, to wanting to ensure that they always make it home at night. And it's an incredible thing. And it builds a certain amount of animosity within parents, that you have to do that you're having to do that to these children, that you rob them a bit of what it means to be a child. And how innocent, it is, what your actions may appear to me because I love you, they may be menacing to someone who fears you.
My name is Bernadette Murray. I want to ask you, there's something I'd like to see teased out, because you mentioned the word serenity, and you've been through such horrible things, and yet you've seemed to, in time, have processed it so elegantly, and you seem to have emerged quite triumphant. You have just agreed to do work with Terence Blanchard on an opera about your life based on the book. And operas typically end tragically. I'd like to know how you process that as an opera, and what your thoughts were when you were asked about it.
First, Terrence is a genius. I'm going to let him worry about that, right? So, yes, Terrence Blanchard is writing the music. Cassie Lemons, who directed Eve's Bayou and Black Nativity, you know, and a bunch of really important films, she's writing the libretto. We met, the entire creative team met, the art director and everyone, and they interviewed me, and we talked and talked and talked, and I told them, like, I don't know what you guys are going to do. I don't have any concept of how this is going to be an opera. And it's not, and you, as long as you're true to the meaning of the book and how I felt, I have at it. So I'm not hung up on it. You know, I just, can I be a little shallow here? When this is over, I will have a soundtrack to my life written by Terrence Blanchard. I'm done. So I just, whatever they want to do.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question. Yes, sorry.
Hi. Unfortunately, I haven't read the book, but I promise that I will. But in it, and in your discussion about it today, there's a theme of the patterns that have existed before you and what they generate. And somehow you've broken that pattern. And I'm curious about how you think you did that, or when you became aware, or how your worldview emanated from a history and a past that sort of seemed to predetermine otherwise.
So, I mean, I have to write another book, but this is what I'm struggling with in the next writing of the new book, which is how much do I project about my own experiences onto other people as predictive or a pattern that can or should be followed or not or whatever. In a way, I lived in this incredible bubble of self-sufficiency, of black self-sufficiency, right? We had this incredible school here that is in every, you know, history book about black schools. My high school is in these books. And you know, there's a white school on the white side of town, which is relatively modest, nothing fancy. When the black people who built this school knew what they were doing. One historian describes it as being on the most beautiful hill in all of Louisiana, right? It is this U-shaped hill. And to get to it, you had to go down this hill. The approach means you have to look up at it when you come to it. It's still like this today. And not only did you have to look up on it, they built these beautiful Victorian 4-foot dormitories. You know, there's nothing in town that's 2 feet tall, 2 stories tall. And yet they built these vertical structures so that not only would you be looking up at the school on the hill, you have to look up at the things you were looking up at. You know, I modeled my descriptions on it, another Bible reference, on Herodium, the fortress Herod built when he was fleeing to Masada. And when they integrated the schools, the white kids didn't want to go to school with us, so they, you know, they organized these academies, and they would kind of get bussed away to this academy so they wouldn't have to go to school with us. It was like 30 minutes away. They had 30-minute bus ride there, 30-minute bus ride. So while everybody else in the black communities in the north were getting bussed out of their neighborhoods, I was walking to my beautiful school, and the white kids were getting bussed away. Everything about what the black experience outside of these kind of pockets that I lived in the South were the inverse of what people think that they should be. Our cops were black. My grandmother lived in a small community that had been homesteaded by former slaves after the Emancipation Proclamation. They were all black. They named the community Qibla, which is the town that, which is the direction in which Muslims pray towards Mecca. I mean, everything about my existence was both prideful and solid and historical. And so I emerged into the world without what I see with a lot of young people who go to, black people, kids who go to really fancy schools, but they're the only black kid in the chemistry class, they're the only black kid in this class, they're the only black kid in AP English. And so they have this incredible scarring because they don't know how other people are judging them, whether they're being judged worthy to be there. I had none of that. And so I entered the working world overconfident. There's no other way to put it. Like it was too much, you know. Charles was too much. I had to bring it down. But it was, there was nothing that I didn't believe that I could do because I had a history that had demonstrated that people like me had always done it for themselves on their own. And I struggle with how much of that I can project onto other people because I think there are pockets of that experience that dot the South. And when people, part of the Great Migration, moved north, they assumed that they would be able to find a utopia that they simply didn't find. And in fact, northern cities started to use the same mechanisms of oppression that the South had always used, which is housing segregation, oppressive policing, all those things. And they didn't have pockets. So you had some neighborhoods were pockets, Harlem and, you know, but you didn't have the experience that I had always known, which is that we had our own.
Very sadly, we have to wrap this up. Charles, thank you so much for speaking to us. Thank you.